Chairman, you've done such a good job since I've been here of providing graphs. So I guess I think imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So I brought a couple graphs here today that certainly I've been showing in Wisconsin to basically describe what I think is the problem facing our nation in terms of economic growth and our debt and deficit situation. And certainly as I was reviewing the testimony that will be given to us here today, my concern is that we're trying to address a problem of fiscal mismanagement with monetary solutions. And I think we're seeing that in Europe, and it just simply isn't working that well. And one of the charts that I showed to groups in Wisconsin, I turned smiling faces into frowns, is I describe the history of our debt. And I like using this one because it shows in 1987, our total federal debt was $2.3 trillion. It took us 200 years to accumulate $2.3 trillion worth of debt. And we just entered an agreement last year to basically, give the President the authority to increase the debt ceiling by $2.1 trillion, and we'll blow through that limit in less than 2 years. That's a little depressing. The next chart will show total spending. And I know an awful lot of people use the shorthand version that we're cutting spending, or we're proposing cuts. Quite honestly, nobody's proposing cuts. This also is kind of a jaw-dropping chart when I show it to groups in Wisconsin, because it shows in 10 years ago, our federal government spent $1.9 trillion. Last year, we spent $3.6 trillion. We've doubled spending in just 10 years. And the argument moving forward is, according to President Obama's last budget, he was proposing spending $5.8 trillion in 2021. The House budget would have spent $4.7 trillion. And I think the graph is pretty visual from a standpoint. We're not talking about cutting the size of government. We're just trying to reduce the rate of growth. Another way of looking at spending is on a 10-year spending level. In the 90s, we spent, put the next one up, in the 90s, we spent $16 trillion over a period of 10 years. The last 10 years, we spent $28 trillion. And again, the argument moving forward is, according to the President's last budget, he was looking to spend $46 trillion in the next 10 years. The House budget would have spent $40 trillion. If you've heard about that $6 trillion in draconian cuts, that's what we're talking about, is the difference between $46 trillion versus 40. But again, I'm an accountant. I can do the math pretty easily. Neither 46 or 40 is less than 28. We're continuing to grow government. And the next to last chart is, this is the really eye-popping one, compares the total liabilities of the United States to the total net assets, private assets. And these are last year's figures. And I haven't revised the chart here. I'll tell you what the new numbers are. But last year, according to the trustees, according to the balance sheet of the United States, the total federal liabilities, the unfunded liability of Medicare, Social Security, our total debt, and the liability to federal retirees was $99 trillion. Now, it's an incomprehensible figure, but if you relate it to the size of our asset base, and that's household assets, large and small businesses, $79 trillion. Now, that's a definition of a huge problem right there. Now, the latest balance sheet of the United States came out, shows the liabilities as $72 trillion. They've revised the estimate. They've made some actuarial adjustments. They're taking a look at the health care law and actually making the assumption that the health care law will reduce health costs. And I guess the point I'd like to make is in many of our estimates here, we're simply deluding ourselves. I don't think it's rational to really believe that the health care law is going to lower our health care costs. The other assumptions we're making, CBO just released their latest baseline. And in that baseline, they're assuming that we're actually going to let these tax cuts expire, all of them. That's a $5 trillion bet. I don't think that's going to happen. The true cost of health care, I've worked with Douglas Holtz-Aiken on this. I've written some op-eds on it. I've taken a look at it. Again, we're deluding ourselves to think that this thing is going to be deficit neutral. It won't. It will add trillions of dollars to our debt and deficit over the next 10 years. And I think the other thing we have to worry about is the economic growth assumptions that are put in these baselines. We've seen a couple studies. The CBO itself says to the extent that we miss our growth targets by 1%, that adds $3 trillion to our debt and deficit. We need to be concerned about that. And I think the final thing we need to be concerned about is we're trying to close the deficit. Again, I think in my graphs, pretty well described a spending problem. And I would just caution anybody that wants to increase tax rates. I want to raise more revenue. by growing the economy. I want to raise more revenue by significant tax reform that's pro-growth. But if we just raise rates, I think we delude ourselves to think that we'll actually have the revenue increases by doing that. I think it would harm economic growth. And in the end, I think that's what we're going to hear in our testimony here today. The solution in Europe is trying to enact governmental policies that will promote economic growth. In the United States, we have the exact same dynamic. We have got to make sure that nothing we do here in Washington detracts from economic growth. So with that, I just have one final chart. It speaks to the U.S. government in relationship to European economies, and to me, this is an incredibly key metric. I'm a business guy, I'm a manager, I'm an accountant, so I'm looking at key metrics. Certainly, the size of our debt in relationship to their GDP is an important metric, but I think this is even more important. When you take a look at the federal government, its size in relation to our economy, it's right now 24%. You add in state and local governments, and total government is 39.2%, which means 39 cents of every dollar that our economy generates filters through some form of government. Now, government does a number of wonderful things, but it's not particularly effective, it's not particularly efficient at many things. And I think it's a very bad metric when you compare it to European-style socialist nations. Congratulations, America, we've arrived. We're at the lower level of European-style socialism. Norway spends 40% of government of its GDP is 40%. Greece, I think we're going to be hearing about Greece and Italy. Greece is 47%, Italy's 49%, France is 53%. That's a metric that I believe we need to manage. We need to start reducing the size of government. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the indulgence here and turn it over to the witnesses.
Good.